2 true scary stories from Reddit. Creepypasta Haunted House Secrets Unveiled. Ethan and Marie stood in front of the old house, taking in the sight of their new home. The tall oak trees surrounding it swayed gently in the breeze, casting shadows on the faded brick walls. The house was older than they had expected, but there was something undeniably charming about it. The peeling paint on the front porch, the ivy creeping up the walls, and the small garden brimming with wildflowers all added to its character. It was a place that felt like it had been waiting for them, a place where they could escape the noise of the city and begin their life together. "We're home," Ethan said, a wide grin on his face as he turned to Marie. Marie smiled back, though her eyes lingered on the house with a sense of uncertainty. She had always dreamed of moving to a quiet suburban neighborhood, but something about the house unsettled her. It wasn't anything overt, just a feeling, a nagging sensation that she couldn't quite explain. She shook it off as nerves. After all, it was a big change. They were starting fresh, away from the city's constant hum, away from the chaos of their former lives. They had found the house through an online listing, a bargain really. It was affordable, situated in a peaceful area with wide streets and manicured lawns. The neighborhood seemed perfect for a couple like them, eager to escape the pressures of the city. And with their savings stretched thin, the price was right. It was a no-brainer. Ethan was already unloading the boxes from their car, his enthusiasm contagious. "Come on, help me get the rest of this stuff inside." Marie nodded, pushing her doubts aside. She grabbed a few boxes and followed him up the creaky steps onto the porch. The door opened with a groan, the hinges protesting against the years of neglect. As she stepped inside, a musty smell greeted her, like old wood, dust, and forgotten memories. The living room was large, with faded floral wallpaper and heavy drapes hanging from the windows. Everything was covered in dust, as if the house had been vacant for years. "Needs a little cleaning," she muttered to herself, though she could feel the weight of the house's silence pressing in on her. They spent the next few hours unpacking, taking in the old fixtures and creaky floorboards. There was a charm to the house, she would admit that. The kind of old-world charm you read about in books, the kind that made you feel like you were living in a time gone by. But as the sun began to set and the house grew darker, Marie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed to breathe with them, the silence almost oppressive, and the walls seemed to hum with an unexplainable energy. Ethan, however, was oblivious to the unease that lingered in the air. He was too busy sorting through their things, setting up their new life. But Marie found herself glancing at the corners of the room, half expecting to see something move in the shadows. That night, as they settled into bed, the house seemed to come alive. It wasn't the sounds of a typical old home settling, creaking floors and the occasional rafter shifting. This was different. These were whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to drift through the walls, brushing against the edges of her hearing. At first, she thought she might have imagined it, but then, as she lay awake, the whispers grew louder. They were not just voices. They were words. Soft, desperate words, like someone trying to reach her. The air grew heavy, colder, and the whispers seemed to press closer, right next to her ear. Marie pulled the blanket up over her head, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in her chest. It had to be the house settling, the wind playing tricks on her mind. She turned to Ethan, who was sound asleep, undisturbed by the strange occurrences. The next morning, Marie tried to brush off the unease. It was a new house, after all. She wasn't used to living in an old place, and she told herself that she was just being paranoid. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at her as she unpacked more boxes and arranged their things. Ethan, ever the optimist, seemed undeterred. He was the one who found it, beneath the floorboards in the living room. A journal. The edges were frayed, the leather binding cracked and worn. He ran his fingers over the cover, brushing off the dust. "This must have been left by the previous owner," he said, flipping it open. The handwriting inside was elegant, meticulous, almost obsessive. As Ethan read through the pages, he discovered that the house had once belonged to a man named Dr. Gregory Stowe, a scientist who had lived there in the early 1900s. According to the journal, Dr. Stowe had been involved in mysterious experiments, many of which were rumored to have crossed into the realm of the occult. His scientific work, the journal suggested, had been focused on human consciousness, specifically the possibility of communicating with the dead. The further Ethan read, the more unsettling the details became. Dr. Stowe had become consumed by his quest to open a portal to the afterlife. His research had led him to the belief that the house itself was somehow a vessel for these experiments, a space where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. The last pages of the journal were filled with scribbles, as if the doctor had been losing his grip on reality, convinced that he was on the verge of something monumental. Ethan showed the journal to Marie, hoping it would ease the tension. But as she skimmed the pages, she could feel the chill creeping back into the room. The house, it seemed, had a past, one that was darker than they could have imagined. As the days passed, they explored the house further. In the attic, they found strange markings on the floor, arcane symbols etched into the wood. There were old photographs too, faded and curling at the edges. The images were unsettling, showing Dr. Stowe standing beside a young girl with a sad, haunting expression. Marie couldn't help but notice that the girl's face had been scratched out in every photograph. The details didn't make sense, and there was something deeply wrong about it all. They brushed it off as quirks of an old house, as random oddities that came with buying a place like this. But with each discovery, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The whispers never stopped, and neither did the strange, unshakable feeling that they weren't alone in the house. Ethan insisted it was nothing, just their imaginations, maybe even the house's natural sounds. But for Marie, the house had already begun to feel like a living entity, one that was watching them, waiting. And as the days stretched on, it became clear that the house's history was far more than just strange, it was dangerous. The past, it seemed, wasn't content with being left behind. It was reaching out. Story 1. The Whispering Walls. The first night in their new home was supposed to be peaceful. It was their fresh start, the culmination of months of planning, dreaming, and saving. Ethan and Marie had arrived in the quiet suburb to escape the noise and pace of the city. The house, though old, had a charm to it that spoke of a simpler time, a time when things were supposed to be steady and calm. But as the night drew in and the house settled into an eerie silence, something else settled with it. Something Ethan could not yet explain. It started off as little more than a soft sound, like the wind brushing against the house, or perhaps the house itself groaning as it adjusted to the cool night air. At first, Ethan didn't give it much thought. He lay in bed, listening to the faint creaking of the floorboards and the subtle hiss of the wind outside. It was normal for an old house, right? But then, as he closed his eyes to sleep, he heard it. A whisper. So quiet that he thought he had imagined it. He blinked in confusion, his mind trying to make sense of the sound. His heart raced as the whisper came again, this time slightly louder, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. The words were indistinct, impossible to decipher. Ethan tried to brush it off. Old houses made noises, especially at night. He turned over, pulling the blanket up tighter around him, determined to ignore it. But then it came again. "Help me." It was a voice of a woman, soft but desperate, barely audible, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His hand shot out to Marie, shaking her gently. "Marie, did you hear that?" Marie stirred beside him, her face soft with sleep. "Hear what?" The whispers. "There's something in the walls. I swear it," Ethan said, his voice a mixture of concern and disbelief. But Marie only mumbled something incoherent and drifted back to sleep, dismissing him entirely. Ethan lay there, wide awake now, listening carefully. The whispers returned, a whisper that seemed to grow clearer with each passing second. "Find the truth." His pulse quickened. What truth? Ethan shook his head, trying to calm himself. It was nothing, a trick of the mind. He was just tired, that was all. The next morning, Marie seemed unfazed when he mentioned the whispers. "You're just stressed from the move," she said with a smile, putting on the kettle for coffee. "You need to relax." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He found himself listening for those whispers, straining to hear any sound, any clue as to what they meant. And it wasn't just the whispers. The house itself seemed different now, a little more alive, its creaks and groans becoming more frequent. The walls felt like they were watching him, as though they knew something he didn't. As days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, more urgent. Sometimes they were only fragments of words. "Help me. Find the truth. It's in the walls." But sometimes they were more direct, almost as if they were speaking directly to him. "Ethan," the whisper called one evening. "Ethan, you're not alone." The hair on the back of his neck stood up. This wasn't just the house settling anymore. This was something else, something that was reaching out, calling to him. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They were sentient, and they were trying to tell him something. Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to investigate. The next evening, when Marie was in the kitchen making dinner, he slipped into the living room and pressed his ear to the wall. The sound was clearer now, the whispers almost palpable, swirling around him like 1,000 voices, all desperate for attention. "Help me." The voice was now unmistakable, clear, distinct. A woman whispering from deep within the walls. "Find the truth." Ethan's heart raced as he pressed his hand against the cold surface of the wall. It felt strange, unnaturally cold, like the air was colder on this side of the room than anywhere else in the house. He ran his fingers along the surface, his mind racing with questions. What truth? Who was this voice, and why was it speaking to him? As he walked around the room, examining the walls more closely, he noticed something he hadn't before. There were small marks on the wall, barely visible unless you were looking for them. They seemed to be etched into the plaster, like someone had scratched at the surface long ago. The symbols were unfamiliar, strange and jagged, almost as if they had been drawn with purpose but without any rhyme or reason. The house felt different now, heavier, as though it were pressing in on him. He couldn't ignore the creeping unease that washed over him. But there was one thing he had to do. He had to find the source of the whispers. That night, as the house quieted once again, Ethan heard something new. This time, it wasn't just whispers. This time, it was Marie. He heard her voice, but it wasn't like any voice he had ever heard before. It was distant, almost as though she was speaking from a far-off place. "You don't understand, Ethan. It's coming. It's already inside you." Ethan's blood ran cold. Marie had never said anything like that. What was happening to her? Why was she acting so strange? The next day, things only got worse. Marie started acting more and more oddly, and Ethan began to notice small, unsettling changes in her. Her behavior had become erratic, distant, and there was something in her eyes, a vacancy that hadn't been there before. She began sketching, constantly, scribbling furiously in a worn notebook she had found tucked away in the attic. When Ethan looked over her shoulder to see what she was drawing, he was horrified. The images were disturbing. Scenes from a time-long past, depictions of strange rituals, dark symbols, and eerie figures standing in a circle. Some of the drawings even seemed to show Marie herself, though she couldn't possibly have known anything about them. She had never been an artist. "Ethan," she whispered one night, her voice hollow. "I saw it. I saw everything." "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with worry. "The house. It remembers," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been waiting for someone like you." Ethan's mind raced. Was she losing her grip on reality, or was something else happening to her? Was it the house that was changing her, or was something inside of it reaching out to them? Unable to ignore the strange happenings any longer, Ethan ventured down into the basement one evening, determined to uncover the truth. The house seemed to hum with anticipation as he approached a section of the wall near the back. Something was off here. There was a strange coldness to the air, and the whispers were louder now, almost frantic. He pressed his hand to the wall, again feeling the surface vibrate slightly under his touch. This was it. There was something behind this wall, something hidden away. With a steady breath, he grabbed a hammer from the workbench nearby and began to knock at the plaster. Each strike echoed through the basement, the sound growing louder and sharper with each hit. Finally, with a low crack, the wall gave way. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he pushed the debris aside, revealing a hidden door. The whispers surged, in intensity, now a cacophony of desperate voices. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his hand reaching for the cold, rusted doorknob. What was waiting behind it? What had the house kept hidden all these years? But before he could turn the handle, the door creaked open by itself, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, and Ethan could barely make out the outlines of old furniture and forgotten objects, but the air felt thick, stale, almost suffocating. Something was waiting for him here, something he couldn't yet understand. And so Ethan stepped into the darkness, the whispers, growing louder still, beckoning him forward. The truth was closer than ever now. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, and as Ethan stepped into the hidden room, he was hit with the smell of old wood and dust, the air thick with neglect. His heart raced, the intensity of the whispers reaching a fever pitch in his mind. He wasn't just in a forgotten space. He was standing in a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed dangerously thin. The room was small, but crammed with decades of forgotten history. Shelves lined the walls, their surfaces sagging under the weight of old, tattered books, some of them bound in what looked like leather, their spines cracked and brittle. Oddly shaped artifacts were scattered across the room, some gleaming with a strange, unsettling light even in the dim glow of his flashlight. Everything felt out of place, like he had stumbled into something that shouldn't be disturbed. The whispers intensified, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the room, as though the walls themselves were desperate for him to uncover what lay hidden within. Among the piles of dusty books and strange trinkets, one object stood out, a large leather-bound journal resting on an old wooden desk, its cover marred with a faint symbol that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Ethan approached it hesitantly, feeling a shiver race down his spine. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, as if guiding him to this particular object. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he flipped open the journal. The handwriting inside was rushed and uneven, as though the author had been writing in a fevered frenzy. The first page was filled with notes about experiments, theories, and dreams. Dr. Gregory Stowe, the previous owner of the house, had written extensively about his obsession with the afterlife, with the dead, and with the space beyond the living world. As Ethan read, a chill settled over him. Stowe had believed that he could communicate with the dead, directly summon their spirits, and even open portals to other dimensions. The words seemed to blur before Ethan's eyes as his gaze moved from one passage to the next. Stowe had been convinced that the house itself was the key to unlocking these portals. According to the journal, he had designed it with secret chambers, hidden passageways, and strange symbols embedded in the walls, all in an effort to create a gateway between worlds. The whispers were not a random occurrence. They were a result of these experiments, and now it seemed the house was alive with the lingering effects of these unfinished works. Ethan's heart pounded. Was this why the house felt so wrong? Was this why the whispers had called to him? He couldn't ignore it any longer. The house wasn't just a house, it was a conduit, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been permanently shattered. He turned the pages with growing urgency, his eyes scanning the text, looking for answers. But what he found instead was a horrifying revelation. The spirits Stowe had tried to summon were not all friendly. Some had been trapped here, unwillingly. And as Ethan read further, he saw mention of a girl, someone Stowe had been obsessed with, someone who had played a crucial role in his experiments. But there was no name, just a photograph tucked into the journal's pages. Ethan pulled it out and studied it closely. The image was old, yellowed with age, but it was unmistakable. A photo of Dr. Stowe standing with a young girl. Her eyes were wide, filled with an expression of sheer terror, her face twisted in a way that was almost unnatural. But what caught Ethan's attention, more than anything, was the fact that her face had been deliberately scratched out, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase her identity from history. The room seemed to close in on him as he stared at the photo. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just random voices anymore, they were calling to him, begging him to listen, to understand. "Ethan," a whisper hissed in his ear, "you're in danger. She knows, she's coming." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The girl, the one whose face had been erased, the one Dr. Stowe had been obsessed with. Who was she? What had happened to her? Suddenly, Ethan was aware of movement in the room. The temperature had dropped, a bone-chilling cold settling in around him. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on the walls. It was as if the room itself was reacting to the dark secrets it held, trying to protect itself from the intruder who had uncovered too much. The whispers morphed into something else now, an indistinguishable cacophony of voices that seemed to surround him. He turned, desperately trying to pinpoint their source, but it felt as if they were coming from all around him, echoing off the walls and vibrating through the floorboards. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were cries, howls of pain, of torment. Ethan's pulse quickened as the floor beneath his feet began to tremble. He staggered back, instinctively reaching for the journal, but it slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The walls seemed to vibrate now, and the temperature plummeted even further. His breath formed clouds in the air, the chill settling into his bones. And then, as if the house had reached its breaking point, a loud crash echoed through the room. The furniture, heavy and old, began to move of its own accord. Chairs scraping across the floor, a table tipping over, objects flying off shelves and crashing into the walls. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind reeling, unable to process what was happening. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But before he could make it to the door, he froze. The whispers had returned, louder now, almost deafening. And in the midst of them, one voice stood out, a voice he recognized. It was Marie's. "Help me, Ethan. Please." His heart dropped to his stomach. Ethan spun around, looking for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The room was empty, save for the scattered remnants of the chaos that had just unfolded. He ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. Panic gripped him as he pulled at the handle, but the door was stuck. He glanced back at the room, his mind racing. What had happened to Marie? Where was she? And then, on the desk in the corner of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A note, written hastily in Marie's handwriting. "I've found the truth. Don't look for me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What truth? What had she uncovered? Why had she left him this cryptic message? The whispers seemed to answer him, but this time, they weren't just coming from the walls. They were coming from all around him, a symphony of tortured souls, each one pleading for release. The truth was out there, and now, Ethan had no choice but to find it. Before it was too late, the air in the house had grown oppressively thick, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he raced through the darkened hallways, his mind a chaotic swirl of confusion, fear, and desperation. Every whisper seemed to lead him further into the unknown. He couldn't stop now, not when Marie's disappearance weighed so heavily on him. He had to find her. The whispers, her voice among them, seemed to beckon him to the attic. At first, he hesitated. The attic had always felt ominous, a place he'd only ventured into out of curiosity. But now, with the urgency mounting and the spirit of the house seeming to speak directly to him, he knew there was no turning back. As he climbed the creaky staircase leading to the attic, the temperature dropped further, and the flickering lights barely illuminated the narrow hallway. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and he could almost feel the presence of something or someone watching him. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him, distorted and layered. Marie's voice stood out in the cacophony, pleading, crying for help. "Ethan, please, find me. You have to understand." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the attic. The air was dense with a sense of dread, thick with the weight of the house's dark history. He scanned the room, his eyes darting across the walls. The old furniture, the forgotten objects covered in dust. His flashlight caught on something. Movement. A figure. A pale, translucent figure stood in the corner of the room. The ethereal form was that of a young girl, her face twisted in an expression of sorrow, and her eyes were hauntingly familiar. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The girl, she wasn't just a ghost. She was the child in the photograph, the one whose face had been scratched out, the one that Dr. Stowe had been obsessed with, the one whose spirit had been trapped in this house for years. Her eyes locked with his, and the whispers surged with a new intensity. The voice of the girl spoke, clear and resonant. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's blood ran cold as he took a hesitant step forward. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, barely audible. "I am Evelyn," the spirit whispered, her voice tinged with both fear and anger. "My father, he created this house, this place, to reach beyond the living. He didn't understand what he was tampering with. And now, because of him, I am trapped. My soul is trapped." The truth hit Ethan like a tidal wave. Evelyn was Dr. Stowe's daughter. She had died during one of his experiments, one of the many failed attempts to open a gateway between the worlds of the living and the dead. But instead of crossing over, she had become a casualty of his obsession. Her spirit ripped from the natural order and caught between dimensions. The house, itself with its strange architecture and hidden rooms, had been designed to facilitate these experiments. The walls, the floors, the very foundation had been constructed to serve as the vessels for the portals Dr. Stowe had been trying to open, and in the process, he had inadvertently created a rift between the two realms, a rift that had allowed the dead to linger, their souls unable to rest. Ethan felt sick. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a tragedy. A trap set in motion by a man's obsession with defying nature. And now it was unraveling around him. Evelyn's spirit floated toward him, her mournful gaze never leaving his. "I didn't mean for any of this. I didn't want this," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "But now you must help me, please. I need to be with my father again. Only you can fix this. You must finish what he started." Ethan's mind spun. Help her? How could he help her after everything that had happened? After all the pain and torment the house had caused? Could he truly fix something so broken? The answer came to him slowly, painfully. He had to stop Dr. Stowe's work, end the cycle that had kept Evelyn and the other spirits trapped in the house. He had to destroy the remnants of Dr. Stowe's experiments. Only then could the spirits be freed. With trembling hands, Ethan turned to leave the attic, but Evelyn's voice stopped him. "You must understand, Ethan. My father is still here. His spirit lingers, watching over me. And so, the house is not finished. The truth lies hidden. If you leave now, the curse will remain." Ethan's heart ached. He had no answers, no solutions, only the overwhelming weight of the past pressing down on him. But if he didn't act now, things would never change. Determined, he made his way back to the secret room, the journal still in his hands. As he read the pages once more, his mind raced with the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The gateway Dr. Stowe had opened was still active, still calling to the spirits who had died in the process. They were trapped in limbo, caught between life and death, unable to move on. Ethan knew what he had to do. The whispers grew louder as he approached the room where the journals and artifacts were kept. He could feel the presence of the house surrounding him, the spirits lingering just beyond his reach, urging him forward. The cold air seemed to thicken and the shadows grew longer, stretching out like dark hands reaching for him. But Ethan had no choice now. With one swift motion, he tossed the journal into the fireplace and watched as the flames devoured it. As the pages curled and burned, a loud guttural scream filled the house. The collective scream of the trapped spirits, of Evelyn, of all those who had been trapped in the house by Dr. Stowe's madness. The temperature in the room spiked, the air thick with sorrow and rage, and for a moment Ethan thought the house might collapse around him. But as the last of the journal turned to ash, the house grew eerily silent. The walls no longer whispered. The temperature returned to normal, and the feeling of being watched, of being suffocated by unseen eyes, vanished. But there was still one thing left to do. Ethan hurried back to the attic, desperate to find Marie. She had been taken by the spirit of Evelyn, the girl who believed that only she could reunite with her father. And though he had destroyed the remnants of Dr. Stowe's work, the connection between the realms was still tenuous, still fragile. Marie had been caught in the rift, and Ethan knew that if he didn't act quickly, she would be lost forever. But when he reached the attic, there was no sign of her. Only the faintest echo of Evelyn's voice lingering in the air. "Thank you." Ethan stood there for a long time, his mind and heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The house was silent once more, its ghosts set free. But he would never forget the terror, the sorrow, the lingering questions about Marie's fate. Had she truly been taken by Evelyn's spirit? Or had she found a way to escape, to break free from the curse of the house? Ethan didn't know, but he would spend the rest of his life wondering. As he left the house, the only thing that remained was a question that would never leave his mind. Was the truth truly found? Or had it merely been buried beneath the whispers of the walls, waiting for someone else to come along and uncover it once more? Ethan knew that for him, the haunting would never end. Story 2, The Forgotten Room. Ethan and Marie had always dreamed of finding a house that felt like home, somewhere with history, character, and a sense of warmth. After months of searching, they stumbled upon a charming, if slightly weathered house nestled at the edge of town. It was old, built in the 1920s, but had been well kept over the years. With its creaky floors, large windows, and cozy rooms, it was perfect for a fresh start. Little did they know, this house would hold secrets that would unravel everything they thought they knew about their new life. The first few weeks were spent unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting familiar with the house. They spent countless evenings wandering from room to room, chatting about their plans and dreams for the future. One rainy afternoon, while Ethan was in the kitchen, Marie ventured into the living room to tidy up. It was during her routine dusting that she noticed something strange, a bookshelf that seemed slightly out of place. It was positioned at an odd angle, and the shelves were cluttered with old trinkets, framed pictures, and faded books. As she reached to adjust the shelf, she felt a strange resistance. Curious, she tugged harder, and with a soft creak, the bookshelf slowly shifted aside, revealing a hidden door. Marie's heart raced. She had no idea there was another door in the living room, much less one concealed behind a piece of furniture. She pushed the bookshelf fully out of the way, exposing a dark, narrow passageway leading into the unknown. A chill ran down her spine, but her curiosity outweighed the instinctive feeling of unease. She called out to Ethan, but he didn't answer, so she made the decision to investigate on her own. The door was heavy, but with a little effort she managed to pull it open. Beyond the threshold lay a small, dimly lit room, untouched by time or the outside world. Dust lay thick over everything, and the air felt stagnant, as though no one had stepped foot in the room for decades. Inside were old furniture, antique, chairs draped in sheets, a large wooden writing desk, and shelves crammed with old books and papers. It felt like stepping back in time, like she had uncovered a forgotten corner of the house that had been sealed off for a reason. Marie slowly stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to the room. As she walked through, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something, or someone, had been here not long ago. But all she could see were remnants of another era, preserved in time. Her eyes wandered over the dust-covered books on the shelves. There was something unsettling about their titles, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. They were all bound in worn leather, their pages yellowed with age. As she gently lifted a few books, Marie noticed something even stranger, the faint markings of a name on the spine of one. Walter Hargrave, it read. She turned the book over in her hands, and the title sent a shiver down her spine. The Secrets of the Forgotten Room. The journal was buried beneath the heavy pile of books, and Marie's fingers trembled as she pulled it from its resting place. As she wiped the dust from its cover, a chill seemed to fill the air, like a shadow had fallen over the room. She opened the book to the first page, where the handwriting was neat and orderly, though slightly faded with time. July 13th, 1927. The first entry read, "I have finally found it, the door behind the bookshelf. For years I have searched, and now I know the truth. The room was hidden away for a reason, and what I have discovered, what I have seen, I cannot begin to describe." Marie's breath caught in her throat. The entry was brief, but it hinted at something far darker than she could have imagined. She turned to the next page, desperate to read more. As she flipped through the journal, the entries grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. Walter Hargrave's writing spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, eerie visions, and disturbing dreams. But it wasn't just the house that had affected him. It was the room itself. His obsession with the hidden space grew over time, and the more he delved into it, the more it seemed to take control of him. As his entries progressed, they became harder to decipher. His words grew more frantic, as if he was trying to escape something he couldn't outrun. Marie could feel her pulse quicken as she reached the final page. She read the last entry aloud, her voice trembling. "The room's true purpose is not to be understood. What I have discovered must never be revealed. If anyone ever finds this journal, they must leave the house at once and never return. For the truth, what lies beneath the surface, is far more terrible than any of us can comprehend." The final line was scratched out hastily, and the rest of the page was blank. Marie's hands shook as she held the journal in her lap, her mind racing. What was Walter Hargrave trying to warn her about? What had he uncovered in that forgotten room that was so terrible it could never be spoken of? And more importantly, why had the room been sealed off all these years? The air in the room grew heavier, thick with a sense of foreboding. Marie set the journal down, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to look around the room again, but something was different. The dust-covered furniture seemed to be shifting, as if moving ever so slightly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow deeper. She felt a sudden coldness creeping into her bones, and the whispers began. Faint at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each passing second. Marie's eyes darted to the door, but it was already closed. She hadn't heard it shut, but there was no escape now. The room seemed to be closing in around her, and the whispers, now unmistakable, echoed in her ears. "You should not have come. You should not have opened the door." Panic rose in her chest. She tried to call out to Ethan, but her voice caught in her throat. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, twisting and undulating as if alive. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could barely make sense of her thoughts as the room began to feel smaller, more oppressive, as though something was waiting for her to uncover its terrible secret. And then, through the darkening haze, one final whisper cut through the chaos, clear and chilling. The discovery must never be revealed. With a gasp, Marie stumbled back, her mind racing. What was Walter Hargrave's terrible discovery? What had he uncovered? And what price had he paid for it? The air grew still, too still. Marie's heart raced as she stumbled over the furniture, trying desperately to find a way out. But the door remained shut, the room a prison now, and somewhere in the darkness someone was waiting. As the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the journal fluttered open once more, revealing one last message scrawled on its final page. "The truth is hidden in the walls. Find. It I before it finds you, and with that the room plunged into an unnatural silence. Marie couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something far more sinister than she had initially realized. The journal she had discovered in the forgotten room seemed to hold the answers to questions she hadn't yet thought to ask. Each page she turned pulled her deeper into the web of Walter Hargrave's life, his obsessive pursuit of the unknown, his reckless experiments, and his eventual descent into madness. She spent hours each day poring over the pages, losing track of time. The more she read, the clearer it became that Walter Hargrave was no mere scholar. He was a man driven by an insatiable desire to push the boundaries of human understanding, particularly in the realm of life and death. He had been a scientist, but not in the conventional sense. His work was experimental, unconventional, and ultimately dangerous. In his journals, Walter detailed his work on the human mind, attempting to uncover the nature of consciousness and whether it persisted after death. He believed that the key to unlocking this mystery lay in creating a mental connection between the living and the dead, a link that would allow one to communicate with spirits and even bridge the gap between life and death itself. The room, behind the bookshelf, Marie learned, had not been a simple storage area. It had served as his private laboratory, a place where he conducted his experiments in secrecy. Walter's obsession with his work had consumed him, and as his experiments progressed, the lines between reality and the supernatural began to blur. He spoke of using advanced methods, hypnosis, isolation, and mind-altering substances, to unlock the human brain's latent abilities. His entries were filled with fevered descriptions of his attempts to reach across the veil to the afterlife. But as the journal grew darker, so too did Walter's mindset. The last few entries were the most chilling. They spoke of an experiment gone horribly wrong. Walter had somehow made contact with something or someone that was not of this world. The connection, he wrote, was instantaneous, but the consequences were catastrophic. The spirit or entity he had reached out to was malevolent, and its presence began to warp Walter's perception of reality. It seemed as though the more he tried to communicate, the more he invited dark forces into his own mind. Soon, Walter was no longer able to distinguish between the living and the dead, and he became convinced that his experiments had opened a gateway to another realm, a place where the boundaries of life and death no longer applied. The journal entries hinted at a final, desperate attempt to sever the connection he had made. Walter claimed he was attempting to close the door, but there were disturbing hints that he had failed. It was as if the room itself had become a conduit for the forces he had unleashed, and that the darkness had taken root within it, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake. Marie felt a sense of dread growing as she read through the journal. The more she learned about Walter's experiments, the more she realized that she was treading dangerous ground. She began to understand that his obsession had driven him to madness, and it seemed as if he had left a part of himself behind in the room, a part that might still be there, lingering, waiting to be discovered. His final entry was particularly unsettling. It was disjointed with frantic scrawlings that made little sense, but one phrase stood out above all others. The room is alive. It watches. It waits. As Marie continued her research into Walter's past, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. She began experiencing strange occurrences of her own. At first it was subtle, a flickering light here, a cold draft there, but soon the sensations grew more intense. Late at night, as she read through the journal in the dim light of the living room, she would hear faint whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. At first she thought it was just the house settling, but as the whispers grew more distinct, she realized that they were not of this world. The voices seemed to call to her, urging her to continue her search to uncover the truth. But each night, as the whispers grew louder, she began to feel as though something or someone was watching her. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, figures that seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, and Marie couldn't shake the feeling that the room was somehow connected to everything she was experiencing. It was as if the room itself was alive, pulsating with energy, waiting for her to unravel its secrets. Ethan noticed the changes in Marie before she did. She had become more distant, her mind seemingly consumed by the journal and the strange happenings around them. He found her spending long hours in the living room, her eyes fixed on the pages, her hands trembling as she turned each one. At first he chalked it up to her fascination with the house's history, but as time went on he began to worry. Marie wasn't the same. She had withdrawn from him, becoming more and more obsessed with the room and the secrets it held. Her once bright, lively demeanor had been replaced by an eerie, almost vacant expression. "Marie, are you okay?" Ethan asked one evening, his voice filled with concern as he sat beside her on the couch. She didn't respond at first, her gaze locked on the journal in her hands. She had been reading for hours, her eyes scanning the pages as though she were searching for something. She finally looked up at him, but there was something unsettling about her gaze. It was distant, unfocused, as though she wasn't truly seeing him. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice flat and emotionless. Ethan frowned. "You haven't been yourself lately. You've been spending so much time in that room, and I don't know, it's like you're not really here with me anymore. What's going on, Marie?" Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes narrowing as if she were seeing something he couldn't. "I have to find out the truth, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something here, something important. I can feel it." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known that Marie had a curious nature, but this was different. She was becoming consumed by the mystery of the room, and it was beginning to take a toll on her. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes locking onto the journal again. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with thoughts of Marie and the room she had uncovered. He kept hearing strange noises coming from the direction of the living room, soft, whispering voices that seemed to call his name. When he finally couldn't take it any longer, he got up and walked down the hallway to check on her. As he approached the living room, he froze in his tracks. Marie was sitting in the corner of the room, her back to him. She was speaking in a low, almost trance-like voice, but there was something wrong with the way she was speaking. Her words were disconnected, as though they weren't her own. The sound of her voice echoed in the room, but it wasn't her voice at all. It was deeper, more guttural and strangely familiar. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. "Marie?" he whispered. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes wide and vacant like hollow sockets staring into the abyss. Her face was expressionless, as if she were no longer aware of his presence. "Walter," she whispered, her voice hoarse and unnatural. "I have found you. I have found the truth." Ethan's blood ran cold. The voice that came from her mouth was unmistakable. It was Walter's. It echoed the same words he had read in the journals. But this wasn't Marie anymore. This was something else, something that had taken hold of her. In that moment, Ethan knew that they were no longer alone in the house. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the empty house, the oppressive silence pressing against him with every step. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the forgotten room, the one Marie had uncovered, the one that had led them both into a nightmare. The air felt heavier now, thicker with the weight of the past, and as he entered the room, he immediately felt the change. It was as if the very walls were alive, pulsing with an energy that didn't belong to this world. Marie was standing in the center of the room, her back to him. The journal she had been obsessing over for days now lay open on the floor in front of her, its pages turning slowly as though moved by an unseen hand. Her head was tilted back, and her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at the ceiling as if she could see something beyond the physical realm. Her once warm and loving expression had been replaced by something far darker, cold, distant, and otherworldly. "Marie," Ethan whispered, but his voice barely cut through the heavy atmosphere. She didn't respond. With a surge of adrenaline, Ethan crossed the room in 2 swift strides, shaking her by the shoulders. "Marie, snap out of it!" But when she turned to face him, It wasn't the woman he loved who looked back. Her eyes were hollow, sunken, and dark, a blackness that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her lips parted, but it wasn't her voice that emerged. The sound was deeper, more malevolent, echoing with the weight of years of torment and madness. "Ethan," the voice intoned, its tone cold and detached. "It's too late. You should have stayed away from this house. You should have never found the room." Ethan staggered back, his stomach churning with dread. "Marie, please. You have to fight. Whatever this is, it's not you." But Marie, or whatever was inside her now, smiled, a smile that sent a chill down his spine. "I'm not Marie anymore," the voice whispered. "I am Walter Hargrave. His mind never left this house, Ethan. His experiments, they worked. He's been trapped here, waiting, reaching out for a new vessel. And now, I am his." The room seemed to shudder in response, the walls bending and twisting as if responding to the words that filled the air. The air grew thick with an unseen force, and Ethan could feel it. The presence of Walter, the malevolent spirit of the man who had once conducted horrific experiments in this very space. It was as if the room itself had become a gateway, and now it was fully open, the dark energies from Walter's work spilling forth. "Why, Marie?" Ethan's voice broke, his chest tightening with pain. "Why did you have to do this? Why didn't you tell me what you found?" But the entity that wore Marie's face only laughed, a sound that wasn't hers but Walter's, cackling, cold, and filled with an unsettling satisfaction. "I had to. Don't you see? The room, it calls to you. It draws you in. And now that you've come, it will never let you leave. Neither of us will ever leave." Ethan's heart raced as the room around him seemed to warp and twist, the walls bending, the air thickening, the very space itself becoming distorted by the force of Walter's lingering presence. The journals, Walter's journals, scattered across the floor began to glow faintly, their pages turning faster, as if they were feeding off the energy in the room. Ethan felt trapped, the walls closing in around him as the room came to life. In a grotesque symphony of energy and madness, desperation surged through him, and he knew that he had to end this now. He turned toward the journals, realizing that they were the key. If he could destroy them, if he could sever the connection Walter had so carefully nurtured, perhaps he could stop the madness from consuming them both. With shaking hands, Ethan picked up the first of Walter's journals, its pages filled with cryptic, fevered notes about his experiments. Notes that described how he had manipulated his own mind and created a mental bridge to the dead. The room had been Walter's sanctuary, his laboratory, and it had become his prison, but now it had become something far worse, an anchor for his spirit, a place where his mind would remain trapped forever, until someone else was found to take his place. "Marie," Ethan called out, his voice desperate. "I love you. You're still in there. Please fight him, and come back to me." For a moment there was silence. Marie's eyes flickered, just for a second. And in that fleeting moment, Ethan saw the woman he loved, her expression filled with confusion, fear, and sorrow. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the hollow emptiness of Walter's spirit. He didn't have time to think. Ethan grabbed the remaining journals, his hands trembling as he held them above the flames of the fire he had started in the corner of the room. With a cry of defiance, he hurled them into the flames. The moment the journals touched the fire, the room seemed to scream. The walls shuddered violently, the air crackling with energy as though the room itself were alive. The floor beneath Ethan's feet trembled, and a low rumble filled the air, as if the house were coming alive, reacting to the destruction of its long-guarded secrets. The room began to collapse, the walls buckling inwards, the floor cracking open. Ethan could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, as though the very structure of the building was being torn apart by the forces Walter had unleashed. But despite the chaos, Ethan could feel a strange calm washing over him. He had done it. He had severed the connection. The spirit of Walter Hargrave was finally being freed, released from the prison he had created. As the house continued to shake and groan, the walls began to crumble, and the oppressive energy that had filled. The room dissipated, leaving only silence in its wake. The fire consumed the last of the journals, their words turning to ash, and with it the room began to crumble, its power fading away. But even as the room collapsed around him, Ethan could not shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Marie collapsed to the floor, her body trembling as though she were waking from a deep, terrible sleep. Her eyes flickered open, and for a brief moment Ethan thought he saw her. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had married. But when she looked up at him, her face was pale, her expression distant. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice fragile. "What happened?" Ethan knelt beside her, his heart breaking as he took her hand. "It's over. We're free." But as he looked into her eyes, he knew that it wasn't true. The woman he had once known was gone. Marie was no longer the same. She had been forever changed by the horrors of the room, the experiments, and the malevolent force that had taken control of her. She was still here, but in some way she was lost. Ethan stood, his legs unsteady beneath him as the house continued to collapse around them. He turned toward the door, his mind heavy with the weight of the choices he had to make. Marie was alive, but she was a shadow of the woman he had known. He couldn't stay. He couldn't keep living with the memories of what had happened here, as Zion. He walked away from the ruins of the house, the crumbling walls and the fading echoes of Walter's spirit. Ethan felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders, but he knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how many years passed, he would never be free of what had transpired in that room. The room may be gone, but the memories of what happened will never leave. The last line echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder of the price they had paid to uncover the truth. Both stories, The Whispering Walls and The Forgotten Room, delve deep into the psychological and emotional toll of curiosity unchecked. At their core, they explore the theme of obsession, the thirst for knowledge and the willingness to challenge the boundaries of what is understood. In both tales, the characters are drawn into mysteries far greater than they ever anticipated, and in their pursuit of answers, they awaken forces that should have remained dormant. These forces, whether supernatural, psychological, or both, manifest as an irrepressible pull towards the unknown, one that seduces with promises of truth, but ultimately delivers nothing but destruction. In The Whispering Walls, it is a house, built on tragic secrets, where a man's unrelenting desire to know the truth behind his family's dark past leads him to uncover a terrifying reality. The walls of his home, his supposed sanctuary, whisper with the ghosts of its tortured past, and in his desperate need to understand, he uncovers a living horror that he cannot contain. The consequences of his obsession are tragic, as he loses not only his sanity but his connection to the world around him, drawn into a cycle of madness that seems inescapable. Similarly, in The Forgotten Room, the destructive nature of curiosity is mirrored through the experiences of Marie and Ethan. Marie's fixation on the journals of Walter Hargrave, a long-dead scientist whose experiments with the mind left behind a haunting legacy, leads her to unearth a terrible truth. Her search for knowledge brings her to a forgotten room that houses not only physical remnants of a dark past, but also the spirit of Walter Hargrave, trapped and yearning for a vessel to continue his experiments. The room, with its lingering energy, becomes a powerful metaphor for the dangers of tampering with forces beyond comprehension. As the room's grip on Marie grows stronger, Ethan is forced to confront the chilling reality that their once peaceful life is being consumed by something that defies logic and reason. Both Ethan and Marie, in their quest for answers, find themselves ensnared by the very forces they sought to understand. They learn that sometimes the unknown should remain unexplored, and that the doors we open can lead us to places from which there is no return. The ultimate lesson of both stories is clear. Obsession with what we don't know can lead to the unraveling of our very selves. It's the price of human curiosity, the tendency to push boundaries without understanding the full scope of what we're confronting, that proves most dangerous. The houses in each story, with their eerie, otherworldly qualities, serve as powerful symbols of the past's lingering presence. Whether it's the decaying walls that whisper of buried family secrets or the forgotten room that holds the twisted remnants of a scientist's madness, both settings represent a kind of haunting that transcends time and space. They are not just physical locations, but metaphors for the unresolved questions and the unexorcised ghost of the past that continue to shape the lives of those who encounter them. The characters may attempt to escape the horrors they uncover, but they are unable to escape the psychological and emotional scars left behind. The houses are more than structures. They are vessels for the memories of a darker time, filled with the restless spirits of those who lived and died there. In the end, both stories leave the characters with a sense of irrevocable loss and haunting uncertainty. Ethan and Marie, though they survive their encounters, are forever changed. They carry with them the knowledge that some things are better left untouched, and that the consequences of our actions can echo across time, leaving a mark that never truly fades. The past, no matter how much we try to escape it, always finds a way to reach out and drag us back in. The lessons learned in these stories are not just about the danger of the supernatural, but about the dangers of human nature itself. The compulsion to know, to understand, and to uncover, no matter the cost. The stories of The Whispering Walls and The Forgotten Room serve as chilling reminders that there are some forces in this world that cannot be controlled. These forces, whether supernatural or psychological, exist in the spaces we can't see, the questions we can't answer, and the mysteries that were never meant to be uncovered. Both stories underscore the terrifying truth that even the most innocent-seeming pursuits can lead to unimaginable consequences. For Ethan and Marie, the houses they inhabit are more than just buildings. They are symbols of the past's ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, that refuse to stay buried. The Whispering Walls and The Forgotten Room are not just locations in a physical sense. They represent the dark corners of the mind, the unresolved grief and regret that linger long after the events themselves have faded into history. The haunting. Truths hidden within these spaces serve as a reflection of the characters' own internal struggles, the personal demons they are unable to escape. No matter how hard they try to confront or understand the dark forces at work within these places, they are ultimately powerless against the legacy of those who came before them. The characters, in their journey to seek out answers, find themselves trapped not just by the forces of the supernatural, but by their own desires and weaknesses. The houses, with their ghosts and dark histories, reflect the inescapable nature of the past, a past that continually shapes the present and ultimately determines the future. The ultimate message of both stories is that some things are better left undiscovered. Curiosity, while an innate part of the human experience, can lead us down paths from which there is no return. In the end, the ghosts of the past are never truly gone. They remain in the walls, in the rooms, and in the minds of those who dare to seek out the truth. Ethan and Marie's lives will never be the same after their encounters with the supernatural. They may have destroyed the rooms that contained the dark secrets of the past, but the memories of what transpired will never leave them. The rooms, the whispers, and the spirits they encountered will remain in the shadows of their minds, forever, haunting their every step. The past, it seems, is never truly buried, and the echoes of those forgotten rooms will linger long after the doors have been closed. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that no matter how far we run, no matter how much we try to escape, the past will always find a way to reach out and remind us that some things are best left undiscovered.